Thank you so much, Varsha. It's really an honor to be here with you and Lynn. And unfortunately, Jamila cannot make it, but as you mentioned, we send her love. I really appreciate this whole effort, and I hope these kinds of conversations really bring us closer to the aim of liberation, and they don't just remain as conversations, but actually can lead to common struggles. And I want to talk about that a little bit later on. But as you rightfully say, the project of the revolution in Rožava and also in different parts of Kurdistan is very much centering women's liberation through autonomy as one of the three main pillars of its freedom paradigm, the other two being radical democracy and ecology. Of course, many of the people who are listening now, and this is also, of course, I know some of the work that Progressive International is doing, is to raise awareness and actively struggle against the climate emergency. And we understand better and better every day that actually the systems that are supposedly claiming, that are claiming to give us the rights and protections and the liberties that we are aspiring towards are actually not just failing, but they are designed to fail. So at the heart of the Kurdish Women's Liberation Movement's project is actually a deep critique of the state and all kinds of other forms of power and oppression that actually hold entire society hostage. So in our perspective, and this is something that is very explicitly manifested in the revolution in Rožava, there cannot be a free society without women's liberation. And that's precisely because we understand that we need to start with the oppression in the most intimate sphere, in the family and in our own communities, in order to be able to play a broader role in the liberation of the world. So the struggle really has this kind of scale, from the family home to the liberation of the region and the Kurdish people in the region, but also on a global scale. What kind of role and mission can we play for the struggle against ecocide, against occupation, against militarism, and so on? And really at the heart of this ideology and practice is putting women's liberation at the heart. And that's not only because women constitute the oppressed among the oppressed Kurdish people, for example, and also the Kurdish people in the context of the Middle East, of course, are often described as a destabilizing force. But we believe that with the solution of the Kurdish question, actually the wider region can also democratize. And but that, of course, comes down to the ways in which we struggle. So, of course, when the Kurdish women's movement over the last 40 years first began to form, it also learned a lot from international struggles around the world. Among the examples that were always kind of discussed were struggles, especially in the global south, on the African continent, in different parts of Asia, in Latin America, and also in Europe. How have women participated in revolutionary processes, and how have they often been sidelined? How have they been pushed back? And this, in the analysis of the Kurdish women's movement over these decades in this literature, it's often said that it is not possible to expect some kind of general liberation of society and then women's rights and labor rights and young people's rights and minorities and so on will be resolved. No. From the very beginning, we have to begin establishing our free institutions within our communities in the here and now. And this is how today also the Kurdish women's movement analyzes the concept of revolution. So against this very patriarchal understanding of revolution as something that will come one day and will be a chaotic process of reorganizing and socially engineering a new society, we think we have this kind of slow radicalism in the Kurdish freedom movement, in which mainly also drawing on the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, who has been imprisoned after being abducted by a NATO-led conspiracy in 1999, that without the liberation of women, we cannot expect there to be a free Kurdish society that is worth living in, if we do not have free social relations within our own communities. So the women's liberation struggle is organized in the Kurdish women's movement in a very systematic manner. It's not something that is just assumed to exist, that women don't necessarily have this kind of liberationist consciousness. It is also something that needs to actively be developed and organized. So a lot of the work of the Kurdish movement in Kurdistan and also in Europe and in different parts of the world in which Kurdish people live, also diaspora communities, is to have parallel to this democratic confederal system that is being built up in Rožava explicitly through the work of communes and assemblies and cooperatives and all kinds of different mechanisms to make the society an inclusive and egalitarian one, with all of its contradictions, of course, because it requires a lot of labor to overcome oppression that is thousands of years old. But parallel to that, we have an autonomous women's system, which means that next to each commune or each assembly that the movement builds, there has to be an autonomous women's structure that can veto the general decisions where also women take place, but there is also parallel like autonomous women's system. And the mixed structures cannot interfere with the women's movement's decisions. We have several principles like the co-presidency principle, which shares power between women and men. And we have these kinds of incentives to kind of really encourage women's perspective on politics, on the economy and everything. But we need these kinds of autonomous spaces also for women to have a space amongst themselves for criticism and self-criticism, to develop themselves outside of this patriarchal gaze. So at the heart of this kind of project is also an internationalist vision, of course, because we believe that at the moment in the 21st century, and we've seen it in the past as well, and today actually we see that the women's movements around the world, alongside also, I would have to say, definitely climate justice actions, especially with young people and many young women at the forefront of this. Women's struggles really are the biggest social movements in the world today. We've seen it on the 8th March kind of rallies this year, last year, and so on. They are transnational, they're horizontally organized, and they demand a different kind of approach and radical perspective on the way society needs to be run. And this, I would say, is also happening parallel to a process in which these very liberal feminist ideas, very individualistic forms of understanding freedom, are entering the mainstream, and we're bombarded with all of these celebrities and rich women and heads of states claiming to be feminists while they are actively suppressing liberation struggles of women elsewhere. So there needs to also come this kind of critique of liberal feminism and its relationship to the state, and how that actually undermines what we mean by having to build this confederal women's system. So in our approach, not only is the Kurdish women's movement in Rožava, for example, unified under an umbrella which unites all of the assemblies and communes, we also have a similar structure inside Turkey and in other parts of Kurdistan that have umbrella structures. We have umbrella movements in Europe, and we kind of organize within the Kurdish women's movement through a confederal system to ensure accountability and democracy in our own structures as we struggle against some of the very, very major attacks that some of the people who are watching right now will know. The Turkish state's invasions and occupation attempts on Rojava, the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, the fact that Turkey is the largest prison for political women prisoners in the world, and all of the specific political femicides that the Turkish state is currently committing against the Kurdish women's movement. So against that, we're saying we also need a women's world democratic confederalism, which basically means that we don't want another kind of international women's organization. There's so many of them, and they're doing all this amazing and great work, but we need to actually move beyond the idea of solidarity. This has been consistently said in all of the statements of the Kurdish women's movement in the last few years, that we need now vocabularies and platforms for common struggle. That today, after so many people have witnessed the Kurdish women's movement's fight against the so-called Islamic State and its resistance against the Turkish state, and also patriarchy in its own community, today is also the time for women and feminists around the world to defend the women's revolution in Rojava, because the women's revolution is not something that is just a day in the calendar that upsets all social relations. It's something that seeks sustainable, free societies in which women can be happy and joyful and rightful history makers again. So this is actually what is at stake. We see that today around the world, women are not only just struggling for more rights anymore. They are having to fight to protect what they have already been fighting for hundreds of years. And the fact that the second largest NATO army, the fact that European weapons, the fact that the same companies that are also responsible for ecocide in many parts of the world are in fact the same forces that either finance or are somehow complicit through their provision of technologies or arms and money and funding or just their mere silence. they are complicit in the destruction of this very promising emancipatory women's liberationist project in Rožava. So we say now it's the time for women also to defend Rožava. We have an ongoing campaign for that. And what I want to stress here is that really that in this kind of 21st century where we see on a daily basis women from India to Brazil, from Kurdistan to Canada, people are struggling against femicide, and we see specific targeted attacks against politically active women. We know the case of Mariela Franco, Berta Cáceres. We know that just this summer 3 Kurdish women activists were killed by a Turkish drone strike in the city of Kobani, which of course many people will know as the city in which women first defeated ISIS. So this is what is at stake, and I think coming up with new terms, with new vocabularies in which we define also fascism, for example, from a woman's perspective, in which we come up with theories and concepts for new forms of internationalisms between struggles, between movements, between grassroots structures. And this is what the Kurdish women's movement is also wanting to share with women around the world, that we need a transnational grassroots women's kind of bottom-up democracy structures for mutual kind of support, so that we no longer just when something bad happens that we write statements for each other and say we stand with you. Now is the time to really organize very powerful feminist, anti-militarist movements, ecological movements, and we believe really that this revolutionary energy that we're seeing in all the women's movements and strikes and marches around the world is something that is really, really, really explosive. And we must really protect the women's struggle from co-optation by the state and co-optation from capitalism. And I really believe that this kind of radical, direct, common struggle that we try to seek and that we also try to embody in our own struggle is really what's going to save the world. So in the perspective of the Kurdish women's movement, as mentioned in all of the statements that have recently been published, we are now in a time where we stand between femicide and women's struggle. It's either the women's revolution, which, as I said, again, it's not a sudden explosion of things, but it's something that we build in the here and now. With every autonomous structure that we build, with every new connection that we make between our movements, the women's revolution is growing. So in this sense, I think I'll stop here, and I'm really curious to hear what Lynn and you have to say. Thank you.